Hello, my name is Todd Miranda, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to work with clipping paths in Microsoft Expression Blend. So let's begin in Microsoft Expression Blend by creating a new project. We'll choose a standard WPF Windows application project. Now if you notice, I've got my environment set up a little bit differently than you might. So let's look at how to do this. If you select Window, you can select either Design Workspace or Animation Workspace. Design Workspace is the default, where you've got your triggers, your objects, and timelines over on the left-hand side, and your project properties and resources panes on the right-hand side, and then you work right here in the center. However, in certain situations, it might be easier to work in the Animation Workspace, which gives you a little bit more room to work with your actual designer view. So let's go to Window, switch back to Animation Workspace. This gives you a little bit more room to work with your window that you can see here. So just a trick, if you've never looked at the Animation Workspace view, it might be a little easier to work that way. So we're going to work in the Animation Workspace view. By default, when we create a project in Microsoft Expression Blend, we get one layout element. It's called Layout Root. It's a grid element by default, and that's fine. We'll stick with that. What we're going to try to accomplish is to show how we can use clipping paths to create some type of fade in or some type of nifty appearing type effect in WPF. So we might make a particular element appear on the page in a particular way. So we're going to use clipping paths to do that, and then a little bit of animation. So let's begin by adding a canvas element to our layout root. We'll double click the canvas element just to give us a default sized canvas element, and we're going to keep it a little skinnier, but we're going to make it a little longer, and we'll just place it right here. Now the canvas in our case is going to act like the container for some controls that we want to clip. And that's a little deceiving because we're actually going to apply a clipping mask to the canvas, but by doing so, all the child elements in that canvas will either be visible or invisible based on whether they're within the region of the clipping path. So let's see how to do that, and maybe it'll make it a little bit easier to understand. First, let's double click on our canvas element. This will make our canvas element the receiver of any child controls. And then we're going to double click on a rectangle to add a default sized rectangle to our canvas. And we're going to stretch this rectangle out a little bit. Position doesn't really matter at this point because we're going to change that a little later anyway. But what we do want to do is give this canvas maybe some color. So maybe we'll make it a burgundy colored canvas. Why don't we increase the radius on the X and the radius in the Y direction to give us a nice rounded corner to our rectangle. Now technically the rounded corner won't matter for the most part because we're probably not going to see it within the clipped region. And we want to set the stroke thickness to 0. We don't necessarily want a border on that. Okay. Now let's add a text element as well. And we're going to add the text element to the canvas as well, because you cannot add child elements to a rectangle. So we'll double click on our text element. We'll add a default sized one. We're going to come in here and put it right in the middle of our rectangle somewhere close to the middle. We don't want a border brush on our text block, and we don't want a background for our text block, and we want our font size to be something that's going to stand out. So maybe we'll choose some type of a bright yellow. And then we'll come down here. We need to increase our font size, and we need to make it bold maybe so it stands out a little bit more. And then we'll put some kind of an exclamation here in for our text. That looks good. So now we have our containing canvas. We've got a rectangle and a text box inside that canvas. And now we're going to clip the canvas so that elements are only visible when they're behind a clipped region. A lot of times you would do this with a rectangular region, but we'll do something a little bit more creative. Let's use the pen tool and we're going to create a path. I just double-clicked Layout Root to make sure that any child controls I added would go back to being applied to the layout root. So let's add a point here and maybe here, and we'll come out here and add a point, back here, here, and then notice how the icon is going to change slightly when I come back and hover over my original point. Notice how we get that little circle showing up. That means that we're going to complete our path. So we're going to click there, completes the path. We can select our direct selection tool, and we can move any of those points around that we want to move around, like so. Alright. That looks good. So now we have this path that we're going to use as our clipping mask for our canvas. We have our canvas that we want to clip. So in order to create a clipping path in Blend, you need to select two elements, and only two elements. One element that will be the path that you want to use as the clipping path or the clipping mask. The other element that you want to be clipped by that mask. The element that you want to be clipped needs to be the primary selection. And that means if you're using the select and then control select way of doing that, it needs to be the last element that you've selected. And an easy way to determine whether it's the primary element or not is to see if it's the one that has the drag and drop handles or the resize handles. So in this case, this is our primary selection because it has the resize handles. If I select the canvas, it is the primary selected element because it has the resize handles. So let's go back to our path. We'll select it first. Then we're going to control click on our canvas. So you see that our canvas is the element that has the resize handles. So we've got both of our elements selected. We can check down here that we've got our canvas and our path selected. We know that our canvas is our primary selection. So at this point, we can go up to our object menu, go down to our path child menu, and select Make Clipping Path. Now, one thing that you'll notice down here is our path is gone. The path that we created that we used as our clipping mask is no longer there. And that's because the element that you use for your clipping path is absorbed by the Make Clipping Path command. So whatever element that you're using as your clipping path, it will be absorbed by that operation and no longer exist as a separate element. It's actually now considered part of the canvas because it makes up the mask, the clipping mask for the canvas. Well, as you can see here, you get an idea of what our clipping path did for us. You can see that we only see the parts of what's inside the canvas that is visible behind the particular area that's the clipping mask. So if we select our rectangle and our text box, we can move that around a little bit, and you can see that it comes into view only as it passes behind that area that made up our clipping path or the clipping mask. So let's see what we can do with this. Let's see how we might use this. I'm going to move the text box and the rectangle all the way over here to the right hand side so none of it is showing in the clipping mask area. And then I'm going to add a timeline. So I'm going to click on our Create New Timeline button. I'll just leave it the default name. And I'm going to tell it that I want a key placed at timeline 0 at 0 seconds. And then at 2 seconds, I'm going to move my elements into view. And when I move them into view, once I set any of the properties on this, you notice that it creates a new key here at 2 seconds. And you'll also see here the kerning path or the kerning on this animation. I'm going to right click on these second keys for both the rectangle and the text box, and I'm going to indicate that I want them to ease in 100%. And this effectively affects the interpolated values from beginning to end, so that in this case, as it interpolates the movement from timeline 0, the point that it was at timeline 0, to the point that it's at timeline 2 seconds. As it interpolates those points, it's going to make them a little bit slower towards the end so that you get a more natural movement. So effectively this is going to ease in to this particular area of our clipping mask. To see what that looks like, we can click on our play button to test it out. And that looks exactly the way we want it to look. We can stop timeline recording. We'll save this. And let's run this project to see what that looks like. And there it is. You see our red rectangle actually moved into the clipping mask area, and then our text "wow" moved in and kind of slowed down to a nice stop where it is now visible within the clipped area. So what we did was we created a container canvas. We added a couple elements to the container canvas. Then we created a path that we used as our clipping path, and we clipped the canvas. So we clipped the canvas so that the child elements in the canvas are the ones that will actually be affected. Those are the ones that will be visible or invisible based on whether they're within that clipping region. Then we simply created a nice easy timeline that simply moved those child elements of the canvas from outside of the clipping path to within the clipping path so that they became visible. And that's an easy way to use clipping paths and animation to be able to get a nice entry effect of particular elements.